Chapter 10 of Buccaneers and Pirates of Our Coasts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Surrett in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Buccaneers and Pirates of Our Coasts by Frank R. Stockton. Chapter 10. The Story of Rock the Brazilian. Having given the history of a very plain and quiet buccaneer, who was a reporter and writer, and who, if he were now living, would be eligible as a member of an authors' club, we will pass to the consideration of a regular out-and-out pirate, one from whose masthead would have floated the black flag with its skull and crossbones, if that emblematic piece of bunting had been in use by the pirates of the period. This famous buccaneer was called Rock, because he had to have a name, and his own was unknown, and the Brazilian because he was born in Brazil, though of Dutch parents. Unlike most of his fellow practitioners, he did not gradually become a pirate. From his early youth, he never had an intention of being anything else. As soon as he grew to be a man, he became a bloody buccaneer, and at the first opportunity he joined a pirate crew and had made but a few voyages when it was perceived by his companions that he was destined to become a most remarkable sea robber. He was offered the command of a ship with a well-armed crew of marine savages, and in a very short time after he had set out on his first independent cruise, he fell in with a Spanish ship loaded with silver bullion. Having captured this, he sailed with his prize to Jamaica, which was one of the great resorts of the English buccaneers. There his success delighted the community, his talents for the conduct of great piratical operations soon became apparent, and he was generally acknowledged as the head pirate of the West Indies. He was now looked upon as a hero even by those colonists who had no sympathy with pirates, and as for esquemeling, he simply worshipped the great Brazilian desperado. If he had been writing the life and times of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, or Mr. Gladstone, he could not have been more enthusiastic in his praises. And as in the Arabian Nights the Rock is described as the greatest of birds, so, in the eyes of the buccaneer biographer, this Rock was the greatest of pirates. But it was not only in the mind of the historian that Rock now became famous. The better he became known, the more general was the fear and respect felt for him, and we are told that the mothers of the islands used to put their children to sleep by threatening them with the terrible Rock if they did not close their eyes. This story, however, I regard with a great deal of doubt. It has been told of Saladin and many other wicked and famous men, but I do not believe it is an easy thing to frighten a child into going to sleep. If I found it necessary to make a youngster take a nap, I should say nothing of the condition of affairs in Cuba, or of the persecutions of the Armenians. This renowned pirate from Brazil must have been a terrible fellow to look at. He was strong and brawny. His face was short and very wide, with high cheekbones, and his expression probably resembled that of a pug dog. His eyebrows were enormously large and bushy, and from under them he glared at his mundane surroundings. He was not a man whose spirit could be quelled by looking him steadfastly in the eye. It was his custom in the daytime to walk about carrying a drawn cutlass resting easily upon his arm, edge up, very much as a fine gentleman carries his high silk hat, and anyone who should impertinently stare or endeavour to quell his high spirits in any other way would probably have felt the edge of that cutlass descending rapidly through his physical organism. He was a man who insisted upon being obeyed, and if any one of his crew behaved improperly, or was even found idle, this strict and inexorable master would cut him down where he stood. But although he was so strict and exacting during the business sessions of his piratical year, by which I mean when he was cruising around after prizes, he was very much more disagreeable when he was taking a vacation. On his return to Jamaica after one of his expeditions, it was his habit to give himself some relaxation after the hardships and dangers through which he had passed, and on such occasions it was a great comfort to Rock to get himself thoroughly drunk. With his cutlass waving high in the air, he would rush out into the street and take a whack at every one whom he met. As far as was possible, the citizens allowed him to have the street to himself, and it was not at all likely that his visits to Jamaica were looked forward to with any eager anticipations. Rock, it may be said, was not only a bloody pirate, but a blooded one. He was thoroughbred. From the time he had been able to assert his individuality, he had been a pirate, and there was no reason to suppose that he would ever reform himself into anything else. There were no extenuating circumstances in his case, In his nature there was no alloy, nor moderation, nor forbearance. The appreciative Esquemeling, who might be called the Boswell of the Buccaneers, could never have met his hero Rock when that bushy-bearded pirate was running amuck in the streets, but if he had, it is not probable that his book would have been written. He assures us that when Rock was not drunk he was esteemed, but at the same time feared. But there are various ways of gaining esteem, and Rock's method certainly succeeded very well in the case of his literary associate. As we have seen, the hatred of the Spaniards by the Buccaneers began very early in the settlement of the West Indies, and in fact, it is very likely that if there had been no Spaniards, there would never have been any Buccaneers. But in all the instances of ferocious enmity towards the Spaniards, there has been nothing to equal the feelings of Rock the Brazilian upon that subject. His dislike to everything Spanish arose, he declared, from cruelties which had been practiced upon his parents by the people of that nation, and his main principle of action throughout all his piratical career seems to have been that there was nothing too bad for a Spaniard. The object of his life was to wage bitter war against Spanish ships and Spanish settlements. He seldom gave any quarter to his prisoners, and would often subject them to horrible tortures in order to make them tell where he could find the things he wanted. There is nothing horrible that has ever been written or told about the buccaneer life which could not have been told about Rock the Brazilian. He was a typical pirate. Rock was very successful in his enterprises, and took a great deal of valuable merchandise to Jamaica, but although he and his crew were always rich men when they went on shore, they did not remain in that condition very long. The buccaneers of that day were all very extravagant, and moreover, they were great gamblers, and it was not uncommon for them to lose everything they possessed before they had been on shore a week. Then there was nothing for them to do but go on board their vessels and put out to sea in search of some fresh prize. So far, Rock's career had been very much like that of many other companions of the coast, differing from them only in respect to intensity and force, but he was a clever man with ideas, and was able to adapt himself to circumstances. He was cruising about Campeche without seeing any craft that was worth capturing, when he thought that it would be very well for him to go out on a sort of marine scouting expedition, and find out whether or not there were any Spanish vessels in the bay which were well laden and which were likely to soon come out. So, with a small boat filled with some of his trusty men, he rowed quietly into the port to see what he could discover. If he had had Esquemeling with him, and had sent that mild-mannered observer into the harbour to investigate into the state of affairs and come back with a report, it would have been a great deal better for the pirate captain, but he chose to go himself, and he came to grief. No sooner did the people on the ships lying in the harbour behold a boat approaching with a big-browed, broad-jawed mariner sitting in the stern, and with a good many more broad-backed, hairy mariners than were necessary pulling at the oars, than they gave the alarm. The well-known pirate was recognized, and it was not long before he was captured. Rock must have had a great deal of confidence in his own powers, or perhaps he relied somewhat upon the fear which his very presence evoked. But he made a mistake this time. He had run into the lion's jaw, and the lion had closed his teeth upon him. When the pirate captain and his companions were brought before the governor, he made no pretense of putting them to trial. Buccaneers were outlawed by the Spanish, and were considered as wild beasts, to be killed without mercy wherever caught. Consequently, Rock and his men were thrown into a dungeon and condemned to be executed. If, however, the Spanish governor had known what was good for himself, he would have had them killed that night. During the time that preparations were going on for making examples of these impertinent pirates, who had dared to enter the port of Campeche, Rock was racking his brains to find some method of getting out of the terrible scrape into which he had fallen. This was a branch of the business in which a capable pirate was obliged to be proficient. If he could not get himself out of scrapes, he could not expect to be successful. In this case, there was no chance of cutting down sentinels or jumping overboard with a couple of wine jars for a life-preserver, or of doing any of those ordinary things which pirates were in the habit of doing when escaping from their captors. Rock and his men were in a dungeon on land, inside of a fortress, and if they had escaped from this, they would find themselves unarmed in the midst of a body of Spanish soldiers. Their stout arms and their stout hearts were of no use to them now, and they were obliged to depend upon their wits if they had any. Rock had plenty of wit, and he used it well. There was a slave, probably not a Negro nor a native, but most likely some European who had been made prisoner, who came in to bring him food and drink, and by the means of this man the pirate hoped to play a trick upon the governor. He promised